Now a word of welcome to everyone who's tuning in on Zoom. And we also have some, actually we have all women in our parish hall. Women seem to have a unique interest in history this evening. So do I, but it's good to have you. And we're gonna go forward. I wanted to talk briefly while we begin our slideshow here, just a brief introduction on two other sources. There was a book, I mentioned this last time, written in the year 1940, and that was by a priest named Father Joseph Curlin. That was for our 100-year anniversary. It's an excellent book. It's available online. If you go to our history page of the website, you could read his book online. Great photos, as well as a 1965 150th anniversary book. I'm sorry, yeah, it's this 150th anniversary, which is by William Campbell, another priest who was here for many years, both associate pastors like myself. And I just wrote the book basically on the parish website. So we have 3 parish history books. I'm drawing from mine, these classes, and they're written by 3 parochial vicars, priests who are not in charge, in other words. I think it just, when you're a priest in charge, you don't have time to do this. So we're gonna look at those priests and many others today because last class we did the people of St. Patrick's Parish. Now we're going to do the priests. Next week is the properties, church buildings, school buildings, all that beautiful stuff. And the 4th week is the voices of the parish, the stories. People are still living now and have stories to share. That's gonna be the only one, too, I repeat, that's gonna be online. Only because we're gonna have many people tuning in and sharing stories. It'd be beautiful. I've already heard most of these stories. I'm just drawing them in to be shared live. One last thing too, in that second book I mentioned from 1965 by William Campbell, How Unsearchable His Ways, in the back, there's this incredible little appendix called Parish Announcements. And you literally have the parish announcements from 1870 until 1965, 95 years of parish announcements. If you read through that for a couple pages, we actually have copies here on the side table. We always have a little museum table on the side. We have the 1940 centenary coins. We have other books. We even have a book by that Joseph Curlin who wrote the 1940 book. He went on to be a priest in the Archdiocese. And he wrote another book called Our Tryst with Him. It's a book on Eucharistic adoration. Very beautiful. We have that on the side here. But just to say that I tried to do a decent job last week with sharing the history of the people. If you go and read those announcements in the 1965 book, it just washes over you every year, some things that were happening, what was going on at the parish, much more detailed, a much better job than I can do. So that was last week. Here we go with drum roll. We see it there on the screen, the priests. So I want to begin by confessing my own bias. When I arrived here as a priest, a young priest, zealous, full of hope, I kind of had a bias. I had seen that we had 3 priests buried in a vault in our church when you walk in the lower chapel. And I kind of had this vague notion of there were these old school priests. They were probably strict. They were probably princes of the parish. In actually reading about their lives, I was corrected mostly. The priests, they have amazing stories. They're amazing men. I'm really humbled by the process. I do want to say it doesn't mean that there haven't been princely things in the church. So just one fun example. Let's begin before we go with our own priest. Cardinal Dennis Doherty, first Cardinal of Philadelphia, the longest bishop. He reigned 33 years. And so I'll give you a little biography. This is just fun, and it's from a whole different era, and it's crazy. So Dennis Doherty came from coal country, but he became a Philadelphia priest, was made bishop of the Philippines. And then he came from the Philippines to be bishop and then cardinal here. There was a parade on Broad Street to welcome him when he first arrived here. And here is what a contemporary newspaper says. The bishop-elect sat in an open limousine, ruddy and smiling behind an entourage of roaring motorcycles, as we have rolling motorcycles right now. 150 brass bands and 75 automobiles followed. Old ladies broke through the police line all the way to run up and kiss the ring. I mean, this is a different era, right? Civic leaders turned out 4,000 strong, including the governor, the state attorney general, the mayor, and all important ministers and rabbis later that night for a grand reception. Basically, the Catholics had arrived in Philadelphia, and this is kind of the leading into the World War II era. I want to, I mean, it's in the Great Depression first, so let me give a few things about him. 1926, there was the 150th anniversary of the United States, and down at Memorial Stadium, down at the stadiums, they had a huge mass. 300,000 Catholics paraded to that mass. Only 80,000 could make it into the mass, and so they set up altars all around the stadium in the parking lots for priests to be offering masses for the crowds. I mean, just things that are hard to think of. You have this footage here of the stadium masses at Memorial Stadium. You have, here he is seated, Cardinal Doherty. You have literally people holding the signs up like they would an athletic thing with a chalice. You know, there's like this religious imagery. He also bought up so much parish property all around the diocese. So Doherty would take these Sunday rides with a Jewish real estate agent called Albert Greenfield. Doherty called himself God's bricklayer because he built so much and bought up so much land. He built in his 33 years 75 churches, 146 schools, 7 nursing homes, and 7 orphanages. And that's not even talking about the land he bought up. That land hasn't changed. So if you look at our tax bill from a few years ago, this is St. Patrick's 2003, and it's in the name of Doherty, Dennis on the left. All the property is still in his name. So I'm just saying there was an era of princes, okay? There was an era where the church had really made its mark. A few fun facts too. In 1934, he was worried about culture, so he put on a movie ban. He made it a mortal sin, this is a bit crazy, a mortal sin for Catholics to go to the movie theaters. So what did they do? They went to Jersey, because you can escape mortal sin that way and still go to the movies. You also have at the 1922 Papal Enclave, he went to vote for the Pope in 1922, was late because of a ship, and so meanwhile he stays overseas in Rome fundraising for the Irish War of Independence. I mean, the guy's kind of larger than life. President Truman sent a representative to his funeral when he died. I'm saying there are people larger than life. Cardinal John O'Hara was the one to succeed him. John O'Hara was the president of Notre Dame University. He was a Holy Cross father. They say one of the first things, O'Hara was a smoker, and so he lifted the smoking ban at the seminary that if you were a seminarian and caught smoking a cigarette, you'd be kicked out for life. I mean, it was very strict. But those were different days. There was an acronym. I like to share this for fun, just while we're touching on bishops briefly. We're about to run through the priest list. It's an acronym school children were taught in Philadelphia. Some of you might know this. So it goes, every child knows now who are Philly's distinguished ordinaries. The first words stand for Egan, Conwell, Kenrick, Newman, Wood, Ryan, Prendergast, Doherty, O'Hara. So there's this, I mean, I didn't memorize when I was in Steubenville, Ohio, our list of bishops. It's just kind of a Philly thing. Like a lot of things in this history, it's just kind of a Philly thing. Okay, let's take a look at different bishops. They weren't all like this. Take but Bishop Neumann, who's a saint. Bishop Neumann did 4 confirmations here at this parish. I brought that confirmation book for those of you attending in person. We can actually see those lists. We have that book right here with us, that old confirmation ritual. He also, he ordained 6 men at St. Patrick's. We actually had at St. Patrick's an ordination by St. John Neumann. And then when he died, there's this very interesting thing. So you have a Requiem Mass, but 30 days later, there was a thing called the Month's Mind Mass, which I had never heard of. And Father Giles told me, yes, of course, the Month's Mind Mass. I was okay. I'm young, I don't hear these things. It's the 30-day anniversary, it's another Requiem Mass. And St. John Neumann, although he was buried out of St. John the Evangelist, which was the cathedral, he was still building, Saints Peter and Paul. The Requiem Mass is at St. John's, buried out of there. His second Requiem Mass was here at St. Patrick's, actually, which is really kind of amazing to think we had a saint's official Requiem Mass in our church. Another example too, I want to jump to this man too, Francis Kenrick. A few brief words, because Francis Kenrick actually founded our parish. So even though he's a bishop and not one of our pastors, we're going to go to the pastor next. He's important to talk about briefly. So Francis Kenrick, I think, is an example of a great and humble bishop. He was born in Dublin. He had gone to Rome, what's called the Urbania. It's pronounced different ways. The Urbaniana, or the Urbaniorum University is this university of the city, was for missionaries. So he went from Dublin to Rome to go to seminary to be a missionary. When he was ordained, he was sent to Kentucky, from Rome to Kentucky. Now in 1808, there was a change in the U.S. where we just had one diocese, Baltimore, and you moved from one diocese to 5 because they added in one fell swoop, 1808, Boston, Philadelphia, New York City, and, ready, Bardstown, Kentucky, for the frontier Catholic family. So he went to Bardstown. Their seminary there was called St. Joseph's, and he taught for 9 years history and Greek at the seminary in Kentucky. The neat thing is this little Dominican connection. The Dominicans were right down the street during the early 1800s. 1805 is when they arrived. Edward Dominic Fenwick, I'll talk about him a little later. So our Dominican founder in the US, from Maryland, he was sent to Kentucky to start the Dominicans. He was living right down the street. They knew of each other. He even, when Francis Kenrick was ordained a bishop, consecrated a bishop, there are 3 bishops that ordained one man, and one of those was Edward Dominic Fenwick. So it's kind of a neat connection. Our Dominican founder ordained the bishop to found St. Patrick's Church. Another neat providential thing about the Dominicans coming here is that the very first Mass here was December 22nd. And I mentioned that was when our order was founded. And then also the Knights of Columbus Hall, directly next door, was the St. Dominic Council for 100 years. Yes.
St. Dominic's 1852.
Oh, so Father Hyacinth, that's a connection. So Father Hyacinth is coming to us from St. Dominic's Church in DC, and Kenrick as Bishop of Baltimore, because he was Philly Bishop and then Baltimore, he founded St. Dominic's. Another brief thing about him is that I like to think too, when he was ordained a bishop, the bishop came, other bishops to ordain him, then he sailed up the Ohio River, and he came up the Ohio River right past Steubenville, Ohio, my own town, which is neat to think about. And then he landed in Pittsburgh, and that was the diocese of Philadelphia then. It was all the way to Pittsburgh and all the way to the Jersey Shore. And so he stopped in a stagecoach all along the route, doing confirmations, doing marriages, all these things on his way. So his first step into the diocese was actually Pittsburgh before he landed in Philly. He landed in Philly and things were in turmoil. Ready for this? I'm going to read this briefly, but we had a lot of drama in the early years of this diocese from 1808. The first bishop was a Franciscan, Michael Egan. Michael Egan died. He was beloved. 6 years, no one wanted to be bishop because all the priests here were sort of, I've got my job. So after the person in charge was a Father Louis de Barth, who was a German priest living in Jersey, who didn't want to interact with anyone. So finally, they convinced this man, Henry Conwell, from Ireland, from the See of St. Patrick, County Armagh. He lost out on the votes for bishop there, just lost out, and so his consolation prize was not St. Patrick's own cathedral, it was Philly. And he was 75 years old already, and he was mostly blind and crippled. And he arrived here in a horrible situation. So he wasn't set up for success. His rival, who got the bishop see in Armagh, said, Philadelphia, I would be less surprised if I heard he was elected Emperor of China. I mean, it was just like, where's Philadelphia? What is he going to do? So he arrives in Philadelphia, and there were many religious priests here, a lot of religious orders. A lot of them were fleeing Napoleon. So you have all these colorful characters, not only the Jesuits, you have all sorts of Augustinians, you have all sorts of Franciscans, even Dominicans I'll go into. There was a Franciscan here, just to give you a taste, a flavor. There's a Franciscan working in town. He was Philadelphia's first canon lawyer. He was dealing with all the canon law. His name was Friar Rico. And he was Franciscan, and he was also a tobacconist during the day. So he sold cigars. And then when they needed him for canon law, he said, sure, I'm a priest, I know about that. Just, it was a little bit of the Wild West, even though it was the East Coast. So in the midst of this, every priest at their own churches, etc., Bishop Kenrick arrived, And here are the stats. There were, at the time, 10 priests in the city. There were 4 churches, and in the large diocese from Pittsburgh to the Jersey Shore, there were just 12 others. So you're talking about 16 churches in that enormous area and only a given number of priests. What's going on when he arrives? It's crazy. The early churches had followed an Episcopalian model of parishes. Bishop Carroll had started this. We have a board of trustees, lay trustees that kind of make decisions. Now, they didn't have the ability to hire and fire priests, but they had some political ability. So what happened is, at St. Mary's, the very first church in this or the second church in this diocese, St. Mary's had a priest named Father William Hogan, who was very dynamic, but he would also insult other priests in his homilies, which other priests didn't like, and he refused to live with them. He lived in his own separate private residence. So Bishop Conwell had tried to, as an old man, invite him, you need to move into the priest's residence. You can't be living on your own. And the people at St. Mary's, the lay trustees, they revolted. They fired all the other priests attached to the church. They banned the bishop from ever stepping into the church, which was his cathedral. And they also wrote letters all around the city saying, we have William Hogan as our priest, and we need to start an American church, not this Catholic church, an American church. Okay, what happened? So this is called the Hogan Schism. There was a split. So Conwell doesn't know what to do. He's evicted from his own cathedral. He removes Father Hogan's faculties, and then there's a next election for another pastor. St. Mary's is just trying to elect the laity a pastor. A fight breaks out. There are real bricks that are thrown. There is real police force that has to break up the fight. And Pope Pius, which one? I think it's Pius VII. Let me look this up. Rome, Pius VII, who was actually kidnapped by Napoleon, believe it or not, a tough guy. He wrote a letter to St. Mary's Church here in Philadelphia, reprimanding them and saying they need reorganized and they need to behave. So finally, Conwell, who was seen as the bishop, as he was called to Rome. He was taken out of the position. He stayed a bishop in Philly, but he lost the power. And they gave administrative faculties to Kenrick. Kenrick comes in, he suspends masses at St. Mary's until things are getting better, masses off. Forceful move. Eventually things calm down, things move forward, things are healed. He builds St. John the Evangelist as the cathedral, which the Franciscan Capuchins are at now, as a larger place. He established the seminary, St. Charles, in his own home. It was on 5th Street, right near Pine, 5th and Pine. Sadly, it's a CVS pharmacy today, that space. But he lived in a townhouse, and he started there and was bringing seminarians from Ireland. So this is a very good bishop that started to found a lot of things and started to get things very healthy in this diocese. Who's the first native seminarian growing up in Philadelphia that he has? It is this man, Daniel Devitt. There you see him. We'll go to him in a moment. Here are the pastors of St. Patrick's. Here is the list. We have 14 pastors. So the first is Daniel Devitt, all the way down to the 14th, who is sitting at my right, Father Hyacinth Cordell. And we're going to go over each of these. So here's some of the stats. I want to talk, before we talk about just pastors, lone men, lone rangers. That's never how it works. Priests work together. They also work with parishioners. I don't mean to give the impression of pure antagonism just because of this thing that happened at St. Mary's. So here are some stats from the 1940 book. Sadly, we only have good stats from 1940. Afterwards, I guess people stopped keeping stats as well. So we had, at the point in 1940, at least 60 priests who had already worked here at this parish, which is a lot. So you can just almost double that, but just under. So we've had about, these days, 100 priests that have assisted here at St. Patrick's. Of vocations, we have had, 1940, 50 men join the priesthood. And again, that probably increased. I know a couple men who are from this parish. I would say it increased to about 75. It's probably about 75 men raised in this parish who joined the priesthood. Well over 100 girls joined to be sisters, mostly St. Joseph's sisters, but others as well. There were also religious brothers. 6 men have become religious brothers, even including a Trappist, right? Real strict, Thomas Merton. Very interesting. and these 14 pastors. So we're going to go through them. There are their dates. Again, I'm humbled to read and to share their stories. I thought I wouldn't be. I thought I'd say, oh, these old school guys. They're also very Irish, let me say. Of our first 7 pastors up until the year 1969, about 130 years of parish history, 2 of our pastors were American. The rest were all Irish. We had a lot of Irish-born priests serving us all the way through the 1960s. I mean, they were so Irish here that in the year 1966, there was a dinner here at the parish for the anniversary of the Easter Uprising, Irish independence. I mean, it's gotten more mixed, it's gotten more diverse, but there's roots in this parish. It was the Irish parish. So here we go. Father Daniel Devitt, he was our very first. Bishop Kenrick wrote in his diary. We still have the American Catholic Historic Society, his diary. Maybe it's at the archives of the Archdiocese. He wrote December 22nd, 1839, in quotes, "A chapel was opened in Schuylkill, 4th Street, near Spruce." 4th Street, the numbers were different, by the way. Father E. Sorin preached. The Father Daniel Devitt celebrated the Mass. I have rented this house for a time with the hope that in a short time, a church might be built in its vicinity. So Daniel Devitt wasn't just laid on, he was the very first Mass, and he stayed on for many years. Let me turn here. Oh, we're going to get to this guy in a minute. Hold on, he's coming up. Born in Society Hill, he was 23 years old when he was made pastor here. 23 years old, 3 months a priest, very young. As I said, the first native priest ordained for this diocese, and he had learned Latin in Bishop Kenrick's house. He was one of his students. He was also sent to Rome, to the Urbaniana, to study at the College for Missions. You can see that college began in Rome for European priests to become missionaries. Now it was turning already that vocations from mission territories like the Americas were going back to study before returning home. He had 3 associates at first: Father Joseph Ignatius Balfe, his seminary classmate, Father Andrew Gibbs, and Father William O'Hara, who will be our second pastor. They were all riding horseback. William O'Hara, fun to think, he was a big horseback priest. He was also a big priest, big man, large man. And it's funny to think of him on horseback. He was not jockey shaped, okay? He was certainly, it's just funny to think of him on horseback most of his life before he got here. While he was working here. Thomas Aquinas, another large saint, died because he hit his head on a branch riding a mule. It just goes to show that that was transportation back in the days, regardless of size. There was this mission circuit being written around. We still have the baptismal records from those mission churches. Port Elizabeth, New Jersey. We have baptismal records from Millville, New Jersey, which is, I may say proudly, the hometown of Mike Trout, the best player in Major League Baseball presently. It's neat. Mike Trout, Millville, New Jersey. We were the first Catholics there. Moving on. I was waiting for cheers, but okay, I'll just move on. So what did Devitt do as a priest? He was here for almost 20 years. So he built our first church. Not only did he start that first house church and get it all going, sacraments, mission writing, he built our first church. He built a rectory. He built the school, all of the first buildings. He really established the parish. He was here during the riots we spoke of last week, 1844. And then in the spring of 1856, he joined the gold rush. And he said, I'm going to California in a big jet plane. That's a Led Zeppelin song. I won't quote more of them because they're not worthy of a parish history class. He joined the gold rush. Theodore Amat was former rector at the seminary here in Philadelphia from Spain. Shows you how international European Philadelphian Catholics were. He was one of the first rectors, not the first, and he had invited Devitt out to California because he was the Bishop of Monterey. He would later be the first Bishop of Los Angeles because they needed priests. They weren't chasing gold. There was actually just many other people chasing gold. Some of them Irish, others marrying in. There was a big mixture of Irish men with Mexican and Chicano women. And there were these communities forming in California, and there were almost no priests. So off goes, this is where he began this ranch. There's still a photo of it. So after a very short time in Santa Barbara, Father Dan went to Visalia in 1861. He founded St. Mary's Church, and he lived in a stable. Interesting. He lived for a while. I mean, the guy can rough it. He rebuilt the town with the citizens after the Great Flood of 1862. The year after he arrived, there was a great flood. He went there for health reasons some. He had lung issues. And living in the city was tough, so he thought, I'm going to help out in California, and I'm going to also be healthier. And he lived there another 20 years. He also went by not only Francis, I'm sorry, not just Daniel Devitt, but he also went by another name out in California. I don't know why. Father Francis Dade. It's kind of like Jason Bourne. You take on new names. They thought it was easier to pronounce among Spanish speakers, Francis Dade. And so he wasn't a religious, but he took on a second name, interestingly enough. What else happened in California? 11 years he spent riding this, he always ride on horseback, a spring circuit and a summer circuit. So he was in Visalia, but he was riding out to these ranches in spring and summer. They would have what are called fiesta days. They would have mass at the ranch. This is one of them here. The Carather Ranch. This is the woman who owns it. You can see that ranch there. It's now destroyed by fire. This is Juana Maria Carather's. She herself was the owner of the ranch with her husband, Samuel. And this was the second church he built. This became St. Anne's Parish in Porterville. Now, we don't have photos of those early ones, St. Mary's Visalia, St. Anne's Porterville. We do have kind of a contemporary. So St. Bridget's Chapel, this is just down the road in Hanford, California. This was built in 1881. You could see the church on the left, very simple. Priest's house, the rectory on the right. Here is the territory he was covering. This lone priest, our first pastor, covered a quarter, 25% of the state of California alone. Fascinating. How did we find out about all of this? Well, as a Dominican, when I was getting into St. Patrick's history, I said, I'm not a diocesan priest. I have no history here before arriving 2 years ago. I felt a little bit, compared to the other priests who had written about this, a little bit kind of out of sorts. Like, should I be doing this? Is it my place? And then I was researching our first priest, Father Dan Devitt, and I found out that, you'll see here, there was a whole book written about him called Apostle of the Valley, the Apostle of San Joaquin Valley, and it was by Sister Mary Thomas O.P., Dominican. So here's a Dominican priest researching this priest in Philly, his first 20 years. Then he jumps to California. Does anybody know about his life out there? Well, there's a Dominican sister who actually has researched and written a book on this. Really beautiful that there's two Dominicans researching this St. Patrick's priest. And I felt really affirmed, the Lord saying, yeah, go forth, research. You're in quarantine. What else are you going to do? And she writes up the whole second half of his life in California. That's how we have this information. These were from the Kenosha Dominicans from Milwaukee. They had gone up to Oregon from Milwaukee, then down to Hanford, California, that last church I showed you. So she was working at this school in California and researched the priest that founded St. Anne's. Another kind of Providence thing, beautiful, ready? Not only a Dominican sister was researching California, this parish Father Dan Devitt founded, St. Anne's, it's the parish of my college roommate who's from California. So my college roommate, Robbie Cruz, I called him up. I said, Robbie, what parish do you go to in California? He said, St. Anne's and Holy Cross. I said, no way. The priest who founded my parish here founded yours. He said, oh my gosh. So we did research and stuff. When that barn, when that ranch burned down, because they would have all the house masses there. We'd ride that circuit. They would have roping contests and dances and mass. They would have a whole weekend. When that place burned, they took the nails from that charred house, and now at the new parish that they built, in the cross, in the parking lot, the big wooden cross, they use the nails from the original ranch. Pretty neat, that thoughtfulness. So we're moving on to our second pastor because we have to make time. Father Dan Devitt, he retired in 1872. He lived very briefly just south of Eureka, California, with the Precious Blood Fathers had built a seminary. So he lived and taught at the seminary a couple of years, and then he died 2 years later, 1874. The Reverend William O'Hara, second pastor, he's called the Old Doctor. He was at once the rector in charge of the seminary and our pastor, and he did both jobs. Now, the seminary was not out in Overbrook yet, It was just across the street from the cathedral on Race. And so he was there. Let's talk briefly about O'Hara, the old doctor. He was well educated, well loved. I think he reminds me a lot of G.K. Chesterton, if you ever read about him. Very beloved, very poetic. He founded many things here, the Literary Society to put on plays. He had a very big heart for the poor and the common man, for workers. They say every one of the blue-collar Irish, he was kind of their priest. They loved him. In the summer of 1856, he became our pastor when Devitt left for California. He was already here 13 years as an assistant priest, already living here, already working here. So 13 years as an assistant, many more as pastor. He was born in Ireland, County Derry, but he came to Philly when he was 4 years old, educated at Georgetown. He had gone to D.C., also to Rome, the Urbaniana, again. Father O'Hara was the one that brought in the sisters to teach at our school. He brought in the Christian Brothers. He also, this is a neat photo, he renovated our sanctuary. So they had the Immaculate Conception doctrine, which was defined. So this is our original sanctuary in Old St. Patrick's. You could see above the high altar is the cross, which today is the Feast of the Holy Cross. He renovated it to have Mary, the Immaculate Conception. You could see if you zoom in there, she's there above the altar. So he did some expansion and renovation. He added, I don't know, not a sunroof, that's in a car. What is it when you open slats in the roof? I don't know, sunlights, just to let in more lighting. We had problems with darkness. Another brief few things about William O'Hara. He's the one who he tore down the first little rectory because it was very wet and damp, and he built our present rectory in 1860. And that's a beautiful, weird emotion. When you're a priest, you arrive at this new city and you're reading these books on the parish, and you read this line that says, the rectory was built in 1860, so the wood floors my feet are resting on, the walls of my bedroom are pre-Civil War. It's just like, what? It's really amazing to think about. And he built our present rectory in 1860. It's still standing. The other things about him is that he put in the first pipe organ in 1863 from C. Stambridge. That lasted well into the 1980s, 1863. And he saw the parish through the Civil War years. I'll just read one thing about him. This happens right after the Civil War, 1867. There was a banquet because he had served for 25 years as a priest in this parish, and they had a dinner for him. There were many speeches, and here's what he said, just a little quote from him. Your compliments given to my years of labor among you are well calculated to thoroughly embarrass me, which is very humble. He told about the parable of the mustard seed, seeing this parish grow as from its small beginnings. And he says this, 25 years, how calmly, how sweetly, how rapidly those years have glided by, it is beyond my power to explain. Here I celebrated my first Mass on these shores. He'd had a brief Mass in Rome. Here I first administered the sacrament of baptism. Here the first couple stood before me to be united in the bonds of holy wedlock. From this spot, I was first called to impart to the dying the consolations of our faith. Here, in a word, I entered upon my career to labor in the Lord's vineyard, and I have remained until the present day. And here I hope to have the happiness to bring my life to a close. Happy indeed have been my days among you, days abounding in wealth beyond all price, the wealth of heavenly consolation. He's a real sweetheart, the guy. And 3 years later, after he had hoped to spend his whole priesthood here, he was named the first bishop of Scranton. He was there, he had his first Mass as a bishop here at St. Patrick's. So his first Mass was here before leaving. He always returned here every St. Patrick's Day, always came back for Mass. They always had him back. When the first church was consecrated, finally blessed, when the debt was paid, they put oil on the walls and wine and ashes and all this wild stuff on the altar and oil and set it on fire. You could read about pre-Vatican II altar consecrations and church consecrations. He came back to do that. So he was still in the parish for 20 years until his death, even though he did move to Scranton. Our next priest, this is fun, ready? Patrick Nugent, also born in Ireland, Northern Ireland. He was the pastor in Manayunk. I asked Gino Barbera, he'd be embarrassed me to talk about it. I said, Gino, you ever been up to Manayunk? He goes, yeah, I've probably been to a bar up there. I guess Manayunk is only good for bars. Anyway, I like Manayunk. It's like San Francisco, the city on a hill. However, when he was elected pastor, Patrick Nugent, our third pastor, he was in Europe convalescing. He had health problems. So he came back from Europe, even though he was struggling with health. Here's the story, right? It's going to be quick. Pay attention now. Came back from Europe. He was pastor here for 7 months. He resigned for health reasons. He returned to Europe, and he was in France for 22 years as chaplain to a French monastery of nuns. Then he died, somewhat young in his 50s. That's all we know. Good, keep going. Okay. Seems like a nice guy. We just didn't know him that long. Father James Mulholland is our fourth pastor. Very liturgical. They say he seldom spoke a single word unless you mentioned the topic of liturgy, and then he would speak eternally. He was very liturgical. He was the one who had the consecration of the church and invited O'Hara. He was an MC and would lead liturgies all around the diocese. Father James Mulholland was also born in Northern Ireland, but he immigrated here as a boy and was raised at St. Philip Neri Parish, South Philly. That's the one I said is a twin sister to Old St. Patrick's. What else about him? He brought into our church, this is very fun, a relic of St. Boniface. He brought this from a trip to Rome. There are 9 St. Bonifaces in the Roman martyrology. This is a 3rd century saint, a young teenager that was in our high altar in Old St. Patrick's, was in our crypt church and it's still in the altar in our church now. We still have a full body of a saint in our altar, even though there's no glass front, like there used to be a glass front. That's also next to the saint, as you can see in the photo, a phial of the saint's blood that was preserved over centuries and centuries. 3rd century we're talking. Who else was there? So Father Ignatius Horstman was his good friend that preached this. Ignatius Horstman went on to become Bishop of Cleveland. You get this sense of all these average priests coming, there's such a small community, they go and become Bishop of New Mexico, Bishop of Cleveland, Bishop of Scranton, Bishop of Savannah. I mean, take one of the priests too who was at St. Anne's. Remember I said that after the riot, St. Michael's was burned, and at St. Anne's, there was a Father Devitt was also founding St. Anne's up in Northeast Philly and ministering there. When they finally got a pastor, that pastor very soon after became the first bishop of Savannah, Georgia. Later, I think it was 3 years later, he died of yellow fever. There was talk about tough things, tough times. We're in tough times now. He died in Savannah. He writes about it in his journal. It's horrific in a way. They're having a hurricane roll in off the coast at the same time they're having a yellow fever epidemic. So there are 4 priests in the cathedral rectory in Savannah. It tore off a whole half of their house, so they're huddled in the lone bedroom that's surviving. It wrecked the steeple they just built in the cathedral, and they all died of yellow fever. Whoa, those are tough times. I'm just saying a lot of priests from these East Coast cities went on to become bishops all across the U.S. because that was the time when these dioceses were so brand new. Like Ignatius Horstman, related to the McShane family. Later on, he became Bishop of Cleveland. Here's a little write-up. Oh no, this is very fun. Ready? Here's a little Irish superstition. I'm going to paraphrase what this says. Basically, apparently, James Mulholland's family claimed to be the first altar servers for St. Patrick. And St. Patrick had handed down the mass bells you ring at the consecration to the Mulholland family. And they were passed down generation by generation by generation until eventually there was a lawsuit because they'd been taken by a museum. They were lost for a time, taken by a museum. Presently, it says it looks like a cowbell. Whether that was the liturgical style at the time, because it was Ireland, but there is a very interesting dispute between our fourth pastor and the altar bells of St. Patrick, which his family was suing the government for. Anyway, moving on, just interesting stuff. Take the new organ. I'm sorry, this was put in, I said previously, we still have the program from 1868, the organ recital. Very beautiful, some of the things that have been saved in this, in our parish archives. James Mulholland, this is going to shock you. So I said he was very big into liturgy. He built our new school. This present building we're sitting in right now, 1883, he built this. And so you now have church with new rectory, bigger, new school, even bigger. We're growing, there's immigration. He added stained glass to the church. 17 years he was a pastor. And after 17 years, wait for it, May 7th, 1886, a telegram arrived from Alexandria, Egypt. Your pastor is dead. He was traveling the world with 2 priests from Baltimore. And it was an around the world trip, a pilgrimage. So they had stopped in Japan, and then they had stopped in Hong Kong, and he had been laid up for about 7 weeks in Hong Kong because he had a swollen foot. Scaffolding had fallen on his foot during the consecration ceremony here. They then traveled, after recovering, to India. They traveled to the Holy Land, these 3 priests, and horseback riding in the Holy Land. He had had rheumatic fever as a child, and it weakened his heart, so he had rheumatic disease. And they had exerted themselves in the Holy Land, horseback riding, these 3 priests. They were there for Holy Week. After Easter, they went to Alexandria, Egypt. He's sitting at breakfast with 2 priests in Alexandria in the morning, and he dies of a heart attack. The irony is, I smile a little, but I also feel bad. This is the highest taste of liturgy in the whole diocese, this priest. And the only Catholics in Egypt were the Egyptian Franciscans, who are not going to give him a very high liturgy. No offense, but they're not going to. So he was actually, his requiem mass is by the Egyptian Franciscans. They did, because it's Egypt, embalm his body. That was very new at the time. Remember, embalming in this country only caught him with the Civil War, and this was just soon after, still wasn't very popular. They embalmed his body, shipped it to the priest. Our priest went up and met it at the ship in New York City. A month later, he did have another mass here at the parish. The parishioners loved him. They wanted him to be buried underneath the altar, and the Archbishop, I think it was Bishop Ryan at the time, basically said, no, we're not going to do that. He is buried at Old Cathedral Cemetery along with his brother. Who is his brother? That man with a beard, a tremendous beard, a Civil War beard, General St. Clair Mulholland, who won the Medal of Honor for his performance at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He also had a sister living at St. Francis de Sales Parish. So kind of a notable local family, our 4th pastor, James Mulholland. We get into our longest pastor. We're going to keep moving. Our 5th pastor for 35 long years, beautiful years, was Father William Kieran. William Kieran's very noble, a great, great man. He's the one who built our present church, and he did a great deal. Why was he here so long? 35 years. The Third Council of Baltimore, which is these meetings of bishops, they made this new status for stability's sake that some parishes, certain places in each city, would qualify as having an irremovable rector. So he was the rector, he's the pastor, he is irremovable, he was in for life. And that came into effect soon after he arrived here. He also was Irish, from Armagh, St. Patrick's, place of his cathedral. It's very fascinating. Came over as a 7-year-old. His brother, Father Thomas Kieran, was the pastor at St. Anne's, which again, St. Patrick established in Port Richmond, or Kensington, or one of the two. I forget. They're right next to each other. Father William Kieran is a 7-year-old, and his mother lived in the rectory with Father Thomas. Very, very curious. Normally, families don't live in rectories together, just priests do, but this is the 1800s, this happened. He was described as 2 things, very interesting, an athlete, and also his friends called him painfully orthodox. When the delegate from Washington, D.C. came to help lay the cornerstone, Diomede Falconio, he gave the speech saying, and I please tell the Holy Father that not a seed of heresy has taken root in our parish. I mean, kind of very noble, very gentle, also loved the common man. People really of the parish, they left him because he loved them very much. That was said of St. Dominic. I love that phrase of St. Dominic in his first biography, which Blessed Jordan wrote. He was loved by many because he loved many. And Father Kieran was very orthodox, but a very great man. He studied at North American College, the NAC. He was sent to St. Anne's in his first assignment. He had his doctorate. He was the Dean of Discipline at the seminary for many years. then became the rector of the seminary. This is our second pastor who was rector of the seminary. And by this point, it was already out at Overbrook when he was named pastor. By that point, they were better developed. They named a new rector. He just became pastor here. But he did also serve on the tribunal for marriage cases as the defender of the bond at the chancery. Father Kieran, what can we say about his time here? He was known to be an orator. I mean, he was Archbishop Ryan. Archbishop Ryan was himself known to be the greatest orator that this diocese has had. And he was Archbishop Ryan's favorite orator, which is really kind of a huge compliment. There were these Quaker gatherings, these Quaker Catholic dialogues, which Archbishop Ryan named him for. So he would go in dialogue with Quakers. There were, he gave the speech at the seminary's, their breaking of the cornerstone for the library, which 40,000 people attended. 40,000 also attended here at our cornerstone, like the biggest event in our parish. We're going over it next week. 1910, October 2nd, Rosary Sunday. He was also the orator, along with all the bigwigs, was Father Kieran, who was there, 40,000 people strong. We have great pictures, lots of photos I'll show you next week. There was the Jubilee of 1892. So we had 50 years where Old St. Patrick's Church was standing, the church. The Jubilee of 1892. This is great. We have details of the procession. Let's read about the procession briefly. It was led by the altar boys, followed by the elderly men of the parish. Kind of a nice sentiment. After the elderly men was one lone old man named James Carr. James Carr is the same one on Christmas Day, made his temperance pledge. He would go to the sisters' convent. They lived in different townhouses. And every morning he would walk and escort the St. Joseph Sisters to 6 a.m. Mass in our church. And so he walked in the Golden Jubilee with the sisters, which is really beautiful, this old man escort for these sisters, because he did that every morning, and on this morning too, the Golden Jubilee. You also had over 50 priests and ministers. You had in that procession Mother Evangelista, who was a religious sister. That was the first person ever baptized, Susanna Deveni. She was the first baptism at the very first Mass in that house, December 22nd, 1839. She was still around the Golden Jubilee. She was the mother, she was a superior of her religious congregation. I think she joined the IHMs. So kind of this beautiful glimpse of the Golden Jubilee. It was a Haydn Mass, so you had violins and cellos. We always had Haydn Masses, that was in vogue at the time. And our choir directors, their names were Miss Nora Burke and Mr. William Thunder. Those were our two long-term choir directors. I don't know more about them. He preached at the Mass, Father William Kieran, the truth within these walls, which is shared in common even upon this earthen floor of our ancestors. We remember now all past parishioners, now in the golden Jerusalem of heaven. It was sort of an anniversary for so many who had worshipped on that floor and had died. Another great event, like I said, is the 1910 Cornerstone. I'll give you just a snippet of his speech at that 1910 Cornerstone. This is beautiful. He was talking about building this church we still worship in. And he said, "To thee, O Lord, we first give the glory, to you. As within these walls, it is you who will make your dwelling, and to pour out your blessings on this generation and all future generations." That's beautiful. That was prayed. You, O Lord, we give glory. You will bless people in this building, this generation and all other generations. Us. He was speaking of us. And then he also added this. He turned to St. Patrick. Every event here turned to St. Patrick. We were always raising the Irish flag, okay? There's more examples of that in a moment. To the apostle of our race, we also lift up our souls in gratitude for his prayer that the faith of Christ, so he's asking St. Patrick to pray for this parish, which is really powerful when he was building this church. We ask for his prayer that the faith of Christ may not depart from the race he converted, and may it see its fulfillment further in this century. Father Kieran died in 1921. Just right before then, he celebrated 50 years of priesthood, a golden jubilee. He very humbly said this. This is beautiful. One looks into his heart, and he feels that he has fallen short of his high ideal. And this reflection comes to me after 50 years of priesthood. That was his main message. I've fallen short of my ideal. And yet he offered Mass for the people. He complimented instead the parishioners during his homily. He complimented the sisters and the brothers who had taught so long at the school, and he called the people of the parish, "You are the jewels in the parish crown of glory." 3 years from then, on the exact same date, 53 years from his priesthood, he died. He had heart condition, very old, was living in Atlantic City briefly for reasons of sea breezes, right? It's cooler out there, less city. And he felt like it was the time, so they brought him back here, and he actually was the first priest to die in this rectory. He died in Father Hyacinth's room. Just to creep you out, he died in your bedroom. He was surrounded by 9 priests. He was surrounded by Cardinal Doherty, the prince of the church we showed at the beginning, who came to give him last rites. He was surrounded by his sister. She taught, she was the director of music up at the cathedral school. There he is there. I'll show you a photo. Him with the altar servers. You had a whole legion of altar boys back in the day. We even still have their names because it's from 1940. That's a 1913 photo. Here are some small little books he had given, small hand missals. We still have these on the side table from 1907. He gave them as a gift. He wanted his parishioners to understand the words of Mass, so he gave them all as a gift, these hand missals. He's very generous to the people. They're called the Key of Heaven. And then also the other one is called, just the New Testament. We still have also on the side table these centenary coins from 1940. You could take a look at those also. Just another piece of history to look at in photos. Heavy coins, very heavy. Here's his sister, Mother Mary Kieran. She looks like him too, if you notice facial structure. So she was at his bedside as well. She was allowed to be there at his deathbed. She became Mother Superior of the St. Joseph Sisters after time teaching music. They processed his body out. This was December, I believe it was December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. They processed his body, the priest singing the Miserere, Psalm 51. They processed him into the upper church. He lay in state all night. This is really beautiful to think about. He lay in state with a chalice in his hands, black vestments, and he was laid in the open right in front of our high altar in the upper church. And people all night, school children, teachers, workers, families, moms with children, all night they processed in to say goodbye to him. And then the Mass was the next morning, starting with a children's Mass. He wanted to have a children's Mass first, and then also a high Mass for the rest of the parish. He was buried in the vault, the very first priest to be buried underneath our staircase. As you walk in on our northern entrance, there it is. It's been built over now if you walk in with sort of a wooden bench look, but you could still see the stained glass. You could see the vault. There have been 3 priests. He was the first buried there. I want to talk about vitality very briefly. How many priests do we have in this photo? 1965. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There were living at our place. This is just to take a brief pause to consider stats. So we had an average of 10 priests living here back in those days. Those priests would oftentimes work at the archdiocese. They would teach at Roman Catholic, etc. But it's just from 1965 back to 1900, we just have a whole plethora of priests. It's very interesting. That's the 1965. I think it's a St. Patrick's Day show. Someone can correct me if they know better. Again, even well into the 1960s, we have priests. It's always been a residence for priests working in the archdiocese. And that's kind of a unique thing about this parish compared to others, where sometimes it's a priest living alone. Old baptismal font, that's cool. That was given away eventually. We have a new one. We've actually had 3, but look at that. We've calculated the baptisms roughly, and there's something around, there's about 50,000, we think, 50,000 people baptized at this parish. And that's a stadium full of people. And it all started for about 50 years in this little rickety wooden font. And then we got a marble font. Now we have a new marble font from 1955. And a few other stats, just for vitality's sake, to get a sense of how busy things were. 1911 was when our lower crypt church was completed. We had a 40 hours devotion preached there to open the crypt chapel by a Jesuit priest, Father Charles Lyons. There was, it went on and on. They say 5,000 people tried to attend that 40 hours devotion. St. Patrick's Day we had with Archbishop Prendergast. There was a 2-week April mission. So for 2 whole weeks, we have the Passionist Fathers preach a mission, and they say, here are the stats. Ready? 1,600 men were tallied at the door, and 2,800 women. Women are still more religious than men. They were in the past and they are now. 2,800 versus 1,600. There was the May First Communions, the May crowning, confirmations with the bishop from Baker City, Oregon. There was just this whole fanfare. The other thing to be said, though, is that even though things were vital, there was also a lot of fatalities. We have in our parish announcements 4 or 5 different young priests, like my own age, 33, 34, who died suddenly because of health care and various things. That priest that founded the White Rose Society, abstinence from alcohol and acting in plays, we showed his photo last time. He was one of the ones, his name was Father William, I forget. But there's just to show that there was some turnover when it comes to healthcare. Okay, so we have these big numbers, but that was more in the air than we realize now. William Curry was his name, founder of the Patrician Cadets. William Curry founded the youth group that didn't drink alcohol. Let's move on. Ready? I won't be too long. We're going to roll through these. Father John Thompson. Here is how his seminary classmate described him in a speech later in life. In quotes, huge, jolly, and beloved. He was a very good man. Father John Thompson, a beautiful thing is that many of our elderly in the parish, take like, for instance, Timmy McSorley, who's 88, take some of the older parishioners, so they're still alive, their grandparents remembered Father Thompson. So now we're reaching into like living memory. Their grandparents remember loving Father Thompson. He was their favorite because he was their era. It's talking about great-great-grandparents' era from us presently. Father Thompson said this because he was already at St. Patrick's for 17 years as a vicar, and he stayed another 16. He was the same as O'Hara. He said this in quotes, the authorities, this is right when he was named pastor. The authorities considered me too heavy to move, so they let me have the parish, which is a fun quote. He was a native son of this parish, born here, baptized here, First Communion, school, St. Patrick's School. He went in this building, which we're in presently. It's just beautiful to think he spent his whole life basically in this church. He and his brother Robert were both ordained priests together. They both had their first Mass here at the church together. In our present church, the upper church, they both had their Mass together. He was at the helm also during Father Kieran's years of illness. Father Kieran was sick. Even during the building of this church, Father Thompson was very much in charge with Father Kieran. He saw the parish through the Great Depression. They continued to have May processions during the Great. I remember there was a sister reflecting. She goes, I remember it was during the Great Depression. She wrote this in an article in the 1980s. In the Great Depression, that we never canceled the May procession, and they never canceled the ice cream. That they always had ice cream afterwards in the parish classrooms, and they loved him for that because he didn't take away ice cream during the Great Depression. He also saw the parish through World War II, and after World War II in the high times to follow. Cardinal Doherty was very powerful, very princely. He left the diocese with millions of dollars in the bank because of all of his acquisitions. He would often call on the telephone. St. Patrick's was in the inner circle then of diocesan life. He would often call and say, Father John, I was thinking of stopping by your house for supper tomorrow night, unless that interferes with any of your plans. And of course, it wouldn't. There would be dinners here oftentimes. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1938, Father Thompson, he died, and he was also buried in our vault next to Father Kieran. That wasn't World War II, excuse me. That was just during the Depression era leading up to it. Our next pastor was Father Vallely. A lot of people here remember Father Vallely. He was our second longest pastor for 31 years, I think. Also from Ireland. He was tough to categorize. Some people think he was tough, strict. They were feared showing him their report card more than showing their moms. And other people say he went to bat for them and he was compassionate. So he certainly had sternness. but he also had a human side. Very Irish and proud of that. We return to Ireland every summer. Here's a fun photo. Here he is when he was made a Monsignor. Here he is as a newly ordained priest, which is a fun photo. Little guy, you know. So Monsignor Vallely was here during the high times. World War II, he saw us through World War II. He basically was pastor right away during those years leading up to it, and then the years afterwards. Let's talk about those somewhat, his years. Let me just talk about this briefly before we go on. He was pastor from 1938, Great Depression, till 1969, Woodstock, which is a span. Imagine that he came into this parish. I like to think of this just in terms of two events. When the Great Depression was starting, and you know, Woodstock, you could say, or they landed on the moon. You know, we were walking on the moon by the end of his pastor, from Great Depression to the moon, which is just startling to think about. There was also during his time a big shift in the neighborhood. So after the war, things started to get more prosperous. I never heard this nickname for Philadelphia. It was called the City of Homes before, because it was all homes. Here's when you have in the 1930s, because of poverty, a lot of those families are moving out of their homes, moving to the suburbs, and you have the high rises in the 1930s springing up. And so you have all of this transforming the neighborhood. Father Vallely inherited a lot of debt. In terms of today's money, $6 million of debt. He walked into that. We needed also new roofs for all of our buildings. We needed new heating for all of our buildings. So Father Hyacinth, don't feel too bad. You don't have it that bad. How did he provide? The almighty game called bingo. Bingo took off in the 40s and 50s. You better believe it. And it raised a lot of money. We had bingo in this parish. It was so hot in this parish. We had it in the school, this floor where we're sitting, second floor, third floor, all the classrooms. We wanted more space for bingo. That men of the parish petitioned, your basement down here, which is the case, is dirt. It's earth. If you let us, Father, pave it over for free in concrete and we can play bingo down there, we'll do it for free as long as we get bingo. He said, sure. So our basement is still paved because of bingo people. That's true. You also have an upsurge in jobs because it was World War II, even though it took time for jobs to come back. Catholic Charities Appeal, we were foremost. It isn't worth bragging about, but if you look at the stats, 1966, St. Patrick's was basically 60,000 above Our Lady of Lourdes in Overbrook, 40, St. Helena up north, 40. I mean, we were really the wealthiest parish during this era. Haven't always been. Now the suburbs are booming more. But it's impressive. You know, St. Andrews in Newtown these days up north, I think St. Andrews has from their collection basket something like 6 million. No, is it 3 million? I know it's a lot, but they also pay for a whole school. I think they have something like 50 employees. So we have like 3. So things change and shift with people, the center city to the suburbs. The Catholic Charities Appeal was founded in 1957. Look, all the priests were calling on the phone. That's a great photograph. All the priests. It wasn't just pay other people. You also have this photo here from the era of the automobile, 1940s, 50s. It goes to show that our neighborhood wasn't so packed. The Depression had emptied things out. A lot of shops had cleared out. And you have this, we had a parking lot, a gravel parking lot across the street in Rittenhouse Square. So it shows that things rise and fall. It's just good to see that. As a look back to the past. So let's talk about this. These were, however, high times. We have had at this parish, ready for this? I'm going to surprise you. We have had 3 Irish heads of state visit us. 2 of them have stayed the night. This is Eamon de Valera, Prime Minister in the year, I think this is 1948. This is Eamon de Valera as Prime Minister of Ireland, arriving by car. Everyone's greeting him. Cardinal Doherty's greeting him in the living room with the governor, James Duff. There's the photo there. You have the full photo of all the bigwigs right in our living room. It's really interesting what happened. He was delayed in Pittsburgh by rain and fog, and all the airlines had canceled. And so Cardinal Doherty, being the powerful man he was, had a private friend. His name was Samuel Pryor, who was a pilot. And he flew to Pittsburgh in a private plane, picked up Prime Minister of Ireland, flew him here to where everyone was waiting at St. Patrick's Rectory for him for dinner. And then he stayed the night because this was seen as the Irish place. I mean, it's surprising, you know, our little place, we've had Prime Minister of Ireland. There he is at the front door being greeted. We have also had in 1959, President Sean O'Kelly. I'm sorry, this is De Valera. This is his autograph. You could see along his arm, he has an autograph photo. This is Sean O'Kelly at the cathedral steps with Monsignor Vallely. Again, 1959, but also stayed the night at St. Patrick's. It's kind of humbling and awe-inspiring to be like, wow, this really was the center of things. I like that photo there, the priest picking up another, this is just another bishop on a plane. There they go, going to the airport, briefcase, hats, going to the plane. In 2017, Enda Kenny, the Prime Minister of Ireland, also just came to our parade mass here. I want to talk about one priest while we're just at a brief interim. Monsignor George O'Donnell, one of Monsignor Vallely's best friends. Every big celebration we had here, every big mass was preached by Monsignor O'Donnell. He was raised here in Philadelphia, but taught at the seminary. He taught literature to college seminarians, and he also taught languages. George O'Donnell is this really great man, and we have almost all of our big homilies that we have preserved are his, even though he gave homilies here when Vatican II happened during Vallely's years. He came in this parish hall right here. He gave all the lectures, kind of breaking people into Vatican II, explaining it, explaining the process. I want to read very briefly from two of his homilies because he was excellent. Sometimes very poetic and flying the Irish flag like nobody ever had flown before. Here we go, ready? On our 100th anniversary as a parish, the centenary, George O'Donnell preached. He began with an image from the poet Yeats, an image of Ireland as an old woman called Dark Rosaleen, or in other poems, Kathleen Ni Houlihan, who will turn young again if the youth rally around her. It's very poetic, you know, very Irish. He loved Irish history, abbots and kings and this and that. And then he says that she now again has the walk of a queen. He says this was realized. This is crazy. This is a Yeats poem. This was realized, Ireland becoming young again when the Irish came to Philadelphia. You better believe that was in a homily. Ready? Here's what he continues. Those sturdy men of Erin came to labor along the Schuylkill. Those virtuous Irish maidens who worked long hours as domestics. The faithful themselves are not gone. Bishops, priests, and laity all owe their salvation to St. Patrick's Church from today, especially and most intimately, children by blood or by spirit. And he gives this whole image of the three-string harp, which is in Trinity College, Dublin, the Dagda harp. And he says there are three strings, three kinds of music. The music of tears, the music of laughter. Both are past chapters of immigration, for there were tears and then there was laughter. The third string is the music of dreams, which we are still forming as Catholics in this country. I don't think I could get away with preaching this kind of stuff anymore from the pulpit. This is 75 years ago. Think of the Dagda harp. I think it is beautiful, but it's of a different era. There's also this, he talks of, there's this funny thing I'm picking up on all the homilies. There was this notion, I'm not making fun, it's just funny to me, of the Irish people descending from Irish kings. They're not slaves like Patrick was a slave, they're descended from kings. And O'Donnell often said this phrase in his homilies, that if we were like the Irish kings of the past, to be faithful, we must first be a listener in the woods and a gazer at the stars. For as he and Monsignor Vallely always said, time was made for slaves, but not for the sons of Irish kings. The sense of the eternal is here and we're not bound by time and labor. I find it beautiful and bemusing at the same time. But I'm a 33-year-old 21st century American kid, so I have my limitations. At the 125th, this is a bit much, he's 125th anniversary, he honors Monsignor Vallely. Imagine me preaching this to Father Hyacinth, ready? No. He talked about Father Vallely's mission to the United States. He called it this way: leaving his native hearth to climb the mystic mountain Slibana. And here, he's calling our parish a mystic mountain. Ooh. And here his heart is content, swinging with the rhythmic motion of a censer and its incense, as he keeps the fire aglow and offers incense to the Most High. I think we could canonize Monsignor Vallely with these words. But it's Monsignor Vallely had him preach all the time, and was very connected. This is one of Vallely's connections. He was very connected with the society forming the Irish St. Paddy's Day Parade. I mean, he was on the board there. You read of all the bulletin things. You know, he had yearly a mass for transportation officials and bus drivers. Imagine a huge mass on a Sunday for bus drivers, and they all go out to breakfast together. Very connected all over the place with the city. He was also responsible with what we're going over next week, renovations. So to look briefly, there's Father O'Donnell preaching. Look at the people he's preaching to briefly. I mean, it's an intimidating audience. Yeah, these guys are intimidating, all these old priests. Look how they look, those hats. Okay. And you also have a full audience. That's a beautiful photo of the 125th anniversary. You have the Sisters of St. Joseph on the left, all the priests in the front, all the people, packed house. We still get a packed house some days too. We've had some funerals here which have been completely packed. Christmas Eve Mass is still, it's very beautiful to see how the faith really does show up in certain seasons. You have a packed house. These are the 1954 renovations of our crypt chapel. Monsignor Vallely, from his own collection, donated his Book of Kells, which is still downstairs. And he also renovated the whole chapel with John McShane, which you're going to talk about next week. He also did not just the 1954 renovations of the lower, but the 1964 of the upper church, the 125th anniversary of St. Patrick's. They had a big celebration. So they had the consecration of the church because they paid off debt. And then they also had the 125th anniversary, 2 days back to back, December 12th, 13th of 64. And then you have, I mean, look at this here. Here's part of the renovations. Here's our church dome before 1964. It had that brickwork, and then they did the gold, the gilded dome, which was done by a Philadelphia company. We're going to go over the renovations next week, but he renovated the entire church in elaborate ways. So he did great things. We have little snippets of their homilies. You can see his homily from 1961 on the second Sunday of Advent on the left-hand side, much shorter than the Dominican priests these days. Better, worse, who am I to say? I'm not sitting there in the pews. I'm just showing you some of our historical artifacts that they gave very brief homilies, which could have lasted 3.5 minutes. But those were the days. Our next pastor too, we're going to really go briefly because these have been our big life stories. So our next pastor, our 8th pastor, great guy, Father Frank Kelly, Father Francis Kelly, nicknamed Foxhole Kelly. He was 1st and 2nd Marine divisions and spent most of his life in the military. He's from out in the suburbs. Was a chaplain in World War II. He was, let's see, he was in the worst of things: Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. He was in the Pacific Theater and did a lot. He has these great sort of sad, amazing articles where he documents in the newspaper. We still have clippings. I'll show you one of these here. The Padre carries in his mind, etched in sharp detail, a night aboard a Navy transport off Tarawa. And Tarawa was a bloodbath. It was horrible. And how they were in the tropical heat and how they're praying, "Holy God, we praise thy name." And he said here at the end, never before or since have I heard a hymn sung with such volume and such fervor. He says there was a Protestant kid playing the organ. They received Holy Communion, perspiring in the tropical heat. And then the very next day after this thing, it says the first man the Padre buried the next day was his good friend, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Amy of Ambler. I mean, these guys from Ambler and Ardmore, I mean, they were serving together a lot of times, and it's beautiful to see those clippings. That's from his days in World War II. Here he is, not in the Navy hat. He's in the dead center. You can see him actually wearing a Roman collar. Monsignor Kelly was here only for 2 years. Why? He was here only for 2 years because he's here 1969 to 71, what was going on in the Vietnam War. He was in the service for the World War II. For Korea, he re-enlisted. And then right when Vietnam was on, he got right back in. So he served in really every war since World War II of the past century. The Philadelphia Inquirer said of him, Kelly, named Monsignor in 1969 at St. Patrick's, served at a number of area parishes, but like a dog to a whistle, he reacted whenever he heard the din of war. Kind of a neat phrase from 69. He returned. It's interesting, he was a big sports guy. He played golf all the time at Springfield Country Club. They said that he was an avid golfer and an avid liar about his score, all of his friends. They said that in his obituary, they put that in there. He also blessed the dedication of Veterans Stadium. When the Vet was built, he was so well known as a sports priest that they called him down to do the full blessing. Our parish priest blessed Veterans Stadium. You guys hear that? That's kind of great, you know. Joe Harkins, who I wish was here, was a peanut and beer vendor at Veterans Stadium, but he's not with us tonight. Okay, here's his obit. He died out in San Diego, retired out near Camp Pendleton, lived at a marina community. He's Navy. Another interesting obit, I mentioned the preacher, George O'Donnell, after all those years. The last year of his life, he was retired in Brigantine. And there was this whole series of newspaper articles because there was a gunman. I think he was actually a bank robber. We have 3 articles on this. A robber and a gunman who had a wife and babies and was on the run from the cops, and he knocked on the rectory door in Brigantine. So this old retired priest opens the door to this scene. The cops are out, sirens, and here's this guy trying to get him with his wife and kid. And he brought him into the living room, and he essentially, over 2 hours, talked him down, because he had a pistol in his hand, and he talked him down and talked him into turning himself in. I think he died not that day, but 6 months later. So interesting what can happen at the very last chapter of your life. Our next pastor is Father Sherry. He was here for 5 years. If anybody in the parish knows more stories about Father Sherry, I have asked around, people say, well, yeah, he was here. He was one of the pastors. I have yet to find any details on Father Francis Sherry. He's in the center. He obviously kept things going during the 1970s. Still living in the house, here's Father Sherry in the center with Archbishop Kroll from Chicago on the right. Here's Monsignor Vallely. Monsignor Vallely retired and still lived here, Pastor Emeritus, for a couple of years while you had these other pastors. Our next pastor too is Father Peter Fitzpatrick, Father Fitz as they call him, basically the priest during the entire 1980s. Some people I know remember him well. During the 1980s, we had our 150th anniversary. Here's a fun thing, ready? St. Patrick's, 150 years, says the Catholic Standard Times. Parish has gone from coal yards to condos, because that's sort of the history of this parish. We still have, this is fun, our dinner and dance after the 150th with Cardinal Bevilacqua was at the Rittenhouse Hotel. We have proof, I'll go through these slides, that the parish had diversified. This is an Italian table. I read you the names of Tofani, De Muzio, Costanzo, Grigio, just to show that because of Rittenhouse Square, we weren't always only Irish. It's proof. Now, we actually don't have tons of other records, but things have been diversified much more past the World War II era when everyone moved to the suburbs and Rittenhouse started to take off, etc. Here we have D'Angelo's in the background, but it's Laglon, which I guess means the corner or the angle. So you have the owner as well. We've had an Italian restaurant next door to an Irish parish for a long time. And we also still have, this is fun, we still have the dinner menu and the seating arrangements from our 150th anniversary. I mean, it's very fancy. Goujonette of chicken with dark ale butter. I can't even pronounce half of this. Funny financial tidbit, ready? We got a $5,000 refund that night from the Rittenhouse Hotel. Why? Because their heater broke. So we had a great mass here. We think only our heater breaks. Well, even at the Rittenhouse Hotel, we went to this big dinner dance and people are dancing in the freezing cold in their jackets so we wrote them a letter of complaint. We still have the letter saying, here's a refund. Sorry. It sounded more professional than that, but that's the gist of it. Our 11th pastor, Monsignor Philip Dowling, Monsignor Dowling renovated this entire building. So what we're sitting in now, the classrooms, et cetera, was a large renovation project in the 1990s. Very beautiful. The Philadelphia Plasterers Union gave a lot of pro bono work to us. There was a lot of kind of donors of workmen, and also the juniors of the Philippatrian Society put in a lot of time. And so this building is as much their volunteer hands as it was also professionals. We also have here too the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra. So in 1999, we signed a contract with the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra. They're still here, they rehearse. They have more than 550 students. They started with 150. Here's their maestro. Well, I'm sorry, first here's a picture of the renovations. The early concept was based on designs. Peggy Rizzo was a woman head of Senior Citizens, Senior Social Club. I never met her. These were their original blueprints. It looked like dining tables. It looked like kind of a hotel lobby, which would have been nice. It turned out instead to be what it is, which is nice too, but it's just not the initial prints. This is the first maestro, Maestro Mean Man, Joseph Primavera. It just goes to show that since our renovations in the 90s, we've also housed the PYO, Philadelphia Youth Orchestra. There's been a close tie, which I think is worth mentioning. I want to say this too, that Monsignor Dowling was the only one of our priests in history, and we say this because we have to be responsible, the one who was removed from ministry. And I want to read a statement. So this is something that happened long before he arrived at St. Patrick's. This is a photo of him from St. Elizabeth's, where he was before. He was also head of the diocese of their social justice thing. I don't think we can't believe in a cancel culture where he was removed. He was accused of something wrong. You could look up those details elsewhere. And that's serious. But also, people ask too, if something happens with the priest, oh, but Father, like, you know, he baptized our baby. We were married by him. I came into RCIA. This is an ancient teaching of the church, twofold, that sin is serious. This is the feast of the cross. And so that reveals sin to us. We have real problems in the world, real sin that put the Son of God to death. But at the same time, we also have to be responsible and say that, like the ancient church, that sacraments, whatever a priest's work is, still works. That's what matters. That's called ex opere operato. It's the teaching against Donatism, that sacraments are never canceled. Things are not canceled out. So we pray for him, and we be serious about what was wrong. But at the same time, we have to realize that his work does remain. It does, simply by theology. I want to read something about that, which I wrote up for the website, which I wrote up in the parish history, which I think is the way I want to address this issue. It's simply this. The many faces of a parish, the many people, past and present, each person attending Mass or lighting a candle as a quiet escape from the city outside, these are the faces of the church. I love this confirmation photo from 1928, year before the Depression. There's a priest with the kids, with the parish dog. Priests need the church, and the church needs priests, and it's supposed to be a family at its best. And this is a beautiful family photo, I think. And this is my statement here. These many faces, these are the history of a parish. History is hard to capture. Yes, we have many books, we have many records and essays like this present one. And yes, it does matter to go over old books, old details, to gain a sense of ancient roots for present living. But this isn't to paint a picture of an immaculate past. Confessions and masses go on together in the life of a parish, confession and Mass. All has not been glorious, revealed in the 2005 grand jury report. Thankfully, the one clergy case associated with our parish was an incident years before the priest's arrival. It's also fortunate we have one case of such a large history, of so many priests, over 100 priests. And then I say this in the statement, still, all Catholics must take the issue seriously and also do penance on behalf of clergy sins. We must know history. It alone helps us see the whole, helps us to breathe easier in seeing the details of each generation's shame and each generation's triumph. If sins can be published, All the more should we publish the details of what is good and true and beautiful in the church and her real life and real people. Where sin has abounded, grace abounds all the more. Paul, Romans 5. This is true in real life, in real parishes. And if we don't see ourselves see it, that grace has abounded all the more in a parish, then we are swayed more by newspapers than the Word of God itself. I think that's true. There's more beauty than evil, and I think that's important to say. Another thing, too, we go to Dan Mackel, our last pastor. This is Father Dan's profile shot. He escapes the camera. He was the last one here. This is from the seminary website. Currently teaching liturgy and is head of liturgy at the seminary. Father Dan Mackel is a great man. We inherited the care of this parish from him in 2018. And I want to talk about why he's a great man. Native son of this parish, like John Thompson, raised here, baptized. It's from his maternal side. His mother's grandparents were here, and his parents were married in our church. He, after years away, returned. He had been here for parish and school and everything else. Father Dan went to Notre Dame, and then he returned to Notre Dame for his MA in liturgy. He came back. He founded the Office of Divine Worship, and he worked there. And then he also later was named pastor. So while Father Dan was pastor here, he was still teaching liturgy at the seminary, and he doesn't drive, so he rode the bus every week. And he also was still involved with everything. So I've looked at the details. He did all the hospital coverage. And he was very good at hospital coverage. He was very steady. There were years when Nancy Tobin took off from teaching catechism. And so for our kids, for our CCD, Father Mackel for a number of years taught single-handedly CCD until Sister Alice from the St. Joseph Sisters was acquired to help him. He taught RCIA, marriage preparation. This is just a man who's a really hard worker. And I think that needs to be said. And he did great work, and things were set up for us to arrive, and that's just the simple thing to say. I'll also say too that he celebrated the 175th anniversary of our parish with Bishop Senior. I want to talk very briefly about the Dominicans. We don't want to say too much, but we want to say a little bit. The Dominicans. There we are at the Easter fire. Father George Schomer, the 12th or the 13th pastor, Father Edmund. We had arrived here in 2018. Very briefly. July 22nd, 2018, we arrived. Father George celebrated his 25th anniversary, his Silver Jubilee in 2019, the year after, the summer. Interesting and sad, Bishop Robert Christian, the auxiliary of San Francisco, who's a Dominican, was in town for another event, the Ukrainian enthronement up at Immaculate Conception, and he stayed with us for the week. He's of a funny family from San Francisco. He's from a millionaire family. His dad invented tater tots, no lie. And then he became a Dominican priest. Well, his son did. Very sad, Bishop Robert Christian was rector of the seminary in Menlo Park, south of San Francisco, preached Father George's Mass, went back to San Francisco, and about 2 weeks later died of a heart attack. Just kind of surprising and sudden. So remember to pray for him. Dominican activities, night class is one of them, many other things are some of them. So just come to the parish and get involved. And I don't want to name our activities because we're living it presently. And now we have this transition to Father Hyacinth and Brother James. Father George moved to Cincinnati because the priest there had a health issue. And so they needed a pastor in Cincinnati. It's a big booming parish. I want to do something fun briefly about the Dominican history, very briefly, in Philadelphia. This is fascinating. I'll read bullet points. The first Dominican to arrive in Philadelphia was the very first year Philadelphia was founded, 1808. William Harold was an Irish Dominican, Father William Harold. He came to join the New York diocese, which had a Dominican bishop from Ireland, Luke Concannon. But because of Napoleonic blockades, Luke Concannon was stuck in Naples and was New York's archbishop, or just bishop, from Naples until he died. So this young priest, William Harold, looked around. He said, I'm not going to be serving in New York. First bishop here, Egan, took him on as his vicar general and planned on having him to be the second bishop to succeed him. But they fought. So Harold left. He went back overseas 5 years later in 1813. Came back, however, when the second bishop was elected, Conwell. 1820, he stayed for 8 years with fellow Dominican John Ryan, and also a diocesan priest uncle from Ireland, exiled to Australia for conspiracy against the British government, but then they let him into America. So anyway, diocesan priest uncle, 2 Dominicans. They were here during that whole uproar, which we talked about, the Hogan Schism. After that time, it's interesting, he was Pastor William Hogan, ready for it, of the Jesuit parish, Old St. Joseph's, first parish in the city. Now, the Jesuits were suppressed in 1773, so for a time it was diocesan. But they had a Dominican pastor for most of those years, 1820 to 1828, until the Bishop of Cincinnati, Edward Dominic Fenwick, our founder. Well, here's a quick photo here. This is our letter saying the Dominicans have arrived and taken care of this. This house has been established in Philadelphia, 2018, signed by our master, Bruno Cadaret. It's in our front hallway. Just knock on the front door. Edward Dominic Fenwick was our founder of the Dominicans in Kentucky, but he became the first bishop of Cincinnati. He heard there's 2 Irish Dominicans in Philly running some parish called Old St. Joe's. He called them to Cincinnati. They said, we're not going to Cincinnati. He actually got the Dominican order in Rome to assign them to Cincinnati officially. So what did they do? Instead of listening to the Dominicans, those 2 priests wrote to the US government, the Secretary of State, Henry Clay, that their rights were being violated. And Henry Clay punted and said, I don't know what this is. I'm going to send you to the Catholic overseer. And there was no delegate or nuncio in DC. So they sent them actually to France, where that presently was for the colonies. And France said, yeah, they should go to Cincinnati if the order's sending them. So instead, they get on a ship, they flee back to Ireland, and William Harold becomes provincial of Ireland. So if you do what you want, sometimes you get what you want. But kind of some wild cards early on. The other Dominicans later on, next Dominican to arrive in Philadelphia was Father John Dominic Beryl. He founded St. Dominic's Parish in 1849, also of the Irish province, 1849, St. Dominic's. Our own province from the US, from Fenwick, who you see here, we arrived at Fishtown, Holy Name of Jesus, from 1912, and we left in 1998. So we were here almost 100 years in Fishtown. And the people there, I've gone there and talked to the secretaries. They have stories. They'll tell you about every priest. Oh, yeah. I get all kinds of stories from them. I've visited many times. Father Giles still goes there for the Dominican Third Order once a month. So we're still connected with them in Fishtown. And I'll just say this last thing, too. Let's talk about extra priests, real briefly. This is Fenwick out in the wilderness, just a fun photo in Somerset, Ohio. Dominicans have the very first church in Ohio, St. Joseph's in Somerset. Began as a cabin, still there, we still have it. Here's St. Rose, where he was teaching this was right down the street from Bardstown, from Kenrick, like I said, St. Rose Priory. There's St. Rose Priory in Kentucky. This is where we began. This is the Dominican beginnings, right here in St. Rose. Let's brush over for 2 minutes a few brief priests. Monsignor James Traynor, he preached the opening mass of our upper church. He was just a boy who was raised in this parish who became a priest, one of those 70 plus men who had a vocation. It's beautiful that they just invited this young vocation to preach the biggest opening mass in our parish history. How amazing is that? Father John Graham, 1920s, basketball coach, neighborhood league, CYO, better believe it. That's fun. I think baseball coach too. He doesn't look like it, but I trust the stories. Father James Dolan was a teacher and rector at Roman Catholic High School, but lived here. He was planning on coming here for a month, maybe, and then he stayed 25 years. So they nicknamed him the man who came to dinner because he just stayed forever. He was given charge of the altar boys. His nickname was Spike Dolan. Jimmy Stewart can tell you that, but he doesn't know why. And anyway, Father Dolan was here for a long time. We have many other priests as well. Father Joseph Finnerty, Father Francis Fay on the top right. It's his practice organ we've been playing in the chapel all this time. To look at the bottom center, the beloved Father Michael Leo Walsh. People loved Father Walsh, who was a vicar. He would invite students to play tennis. He was out there on the tennis courts. He'd show up at people's birthday parties. He was chaplain to the Senior Citizens Club. He was always at bowling leagues. 70s and 80s, bowling took off. Maybe some of you remember that. The lanes were in South Philly, but the banquets were here in Rittenhouse. He was just this they say you could hear his laugh from around the corner. He eventually went to the IHM sisters out in the suburbs at Camilla Hall. And the sisters say they remember that before he gave the Eucharist to every sister, he'd wink at them and then give them the Eucharist just to show his love for them. So the last one too is this, Father Augustus Tolton. I said I would give this last time. Augustus Tolton was from the Diocese of Chicago, the first black man from the United States to be ordained a priest. And he visited here in 1890, December 14th, to preach one of our masses, and then also to have a meeting of Black Catholics in our parish hall. We had a chapter of Black Catholics that did belong to our parish, and they had that meeting from neighboring parishes too in this hall. He came back a second time in 1892, 2 years later, for Vespers here because St. Peter Claver was being dedicated. There's this incredible history of education before the Blacks could be in the public school system. You had the sisters right near us from De Namur who educated them. And then after them, Catherine Drexel herself, single-handedly. And then after them, you have the priests, the Holy Spirit fathers from St. Peter Claver. They founded that church. You have this incredible Catholic network in the few blocks from here who took on educated, baptized, raised these children and their families. So it's just a neat addition too, is that he had visited our parish twice, and that was a big deal even back then. We also have other things. We had a priest his name was Father Manuel Campas. He lived here for years because he was a refugee during the Cristero War when Mexico turned against us. The 1917 Constitution. They became very anti-Catholic. So Father Manuel fled and lived here at this parish, serving for a time. He returned to Mexico, San Luis Potosi, and we did fundraisers sending their parishes. There's a whole river mix of priests that have passed through here. So the goal of this class is to have an appreciation for the many men who gave their lives to Christ, and then they served real people, real masses, real sacraments for a lifetime. So it's beautiful to reflect on the whole history of Christ calls priests, and then he sends them to real places like St. Patrick's Parish. How many of those men have lived here, served here, had interesting things, good things? So my pitch is pray for them. Pray for us present priests, because we need prayers day to day. And pray for the priests who served here, past tense, because that's a beautiful prayer. If we are attending Mass here at all, at this parish, it's a beautiful thing to go back and to pray for the repose of the souls of all the faithfully departed, priests included. So that's it. We could take a question or two. I'm sorry to go on. We have a big, big history. I'm going to stop the screen share. Anybody too have a question or two? You can unmute yourselves. Maybe not, maybe so. Anybody here? No. It's a roller coaster ride. I apologize. Chris is just nodding his head. Yes, Christine, please.
I know this is about Monsignor Dowling, but this is a little anecdote that
Sure,
I always
sure.
think about with him, which is
So
that
she's saying an anecdote about Monsignor Dowling. Yes, please, because they can't hear you.
at every Easter, he would invite all the children to come up and show off their Easter finery.
Yeah,
And
so
when
the
they
kids would be
came up-
invited up to show off their Easter finery at Mass, show off what they're
And
wearing.
he sang Easter Parade.
And he sang Easter Parade. What's that, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers?
It's no, it's from the movie with Judy Garland and yeah,
Judy
Fred Astaire,
Garland.
yes.
Got you. That
Fred
is
Astaire's
beautiful.
in it,
That is
but
really
it
beautiful.
was just a cappella, and it was just so sweet.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
did it
Thank you for
every year.
sharing that. That's very beautiful. Anybody else too? Quick thoughts or questions? Maybe we're just learning. Yes. Well, if not, we can close with a prayer. What is the statute? What is the status of the cause for Father Tolton? Father Hyacinth is asking me. I don't know. There's the answer. So here's another few questions too that people had sent in. What priests are buried in our memorial? Did St. Catherine Drexel ever visit the parish? I don't know about Catherine Drexel visiting the parish. I do know, however, that the priest buried would be Father Kieran, who built the church, Father Thompson, his successor, and then Father Monsignor Vallely all those years. Those three in a row were buried in our vault, but it's been sealed since. Please repeat the name of the Chicago priest that's in writing there. Augustus Tolton, Tolton. It's amazing. He was a slave in Hannibal, Missouri. Hannibal, Missouri is the same town Mark Twain is from. And he actually, he received freedom, and he actually later in life baptized his former master into the Catholic Church. It's an incredibly powerful story. There's also a powerful play that's a one-man play that's been acted out. Certainly someone to look into, and certainly should have a cause for canonization if we could look at more details. Kara, did you have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I didn't.
Oh, okay, I was just saying. So if we have another question, that's great, but we can also end there with a brief prayer. He's a servant of God, Father Hyacinth says. That's great. So he's in process. That's the official first step. Okay. So let's pray in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, we ask you to bless priests, to give them grace that they need, to bless the souls of the faithful departed who have been priests, especially those of our parish. We give you thanks for their service, for their years of giving their whole lives to this parish. And we ask you give the grace to priests presently to continue to give their lives to Christ, give their lives to the people of God, the people of their parish, so that we may truly be a family. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. As a priest, I give you a blessing. And we'll see you next week for the properties. We're talking about parishes, schools, rectories, this and that. Peace, everyone, and a blessed week. Thanks now. All right.